Good morning and welcome to The Art of Composition. Thanks for joining me today. Appreciate it, as always. Today I want to look at a Juliette Aristides painting. She's always been one of my favorite modern classically trained artists. She is a student of, I believe she started with Myron Barnstone when she was very young. I want to say maybe 16 years old. I could be wrong, but I think she started with Barnstone and then moved on to other things. And myself, I started with the Barnstone DVDs. I love them. I watched them for years, endlessly for years. And I learned so much about design, even though I don't really use his methods for analyzing work, because I tend to analyze more modern work. Myron was more into the classics like Degas and, Da Vinci and all that. I tend to analyze more modern stuff, so it fits the harmonic armature better. But if you're interested in all the dynamic symmetry side of that, I do recommend his DVDs, and I do have a ton of information on dynamic symmetry. Even though I don't really teach it anymore, I do have videos on it if you want to go down that lane. But I will say this, dynamic symmetry, I personally believe you have to learn that one-on-one. You need a trainer to walk you through it because it is definitely more complicated. It's not something you can effectively learn online. I don't think so. I haven't seen, in the years I've been doing this, many people that actually understand it, even in its most basic form. Like, I always recommend Mikhail Jacobs' book, and I have it on my website. You can download it for free. I have a high-resolution copy. But even that book, I think people tend to get confused. And some of the issues that I have with it is that you're working in specific size rectangles. And I think artists today want a little bit more flexibility because the canvases today tend to be more generic sizes, like, 11 by 14, 16 by 20. I think you have a couple root rectangle shapes in there somewhere. But anyway, I'm just really teaching in the harmonic armature now. I think it's the best system to learn. When you're first starting out, it's much, much easier. Anyway, so with that said, I'm just going to take a look at this painting. I want to point out a few things before I drop the armature down on this painting. So a couple things. I want to point out the dominant lines here, okay? You have generally 3 dominant lines. So let me start there. In this painting, you have a dominant horizontal, which is right here. Okay, even though it's located far at the bottom of the painting, it's still your dominant. If you squint your eyes, you can tell it really stands out. Let me remove this again. But if I bring this down to the size of a thumbnail, your divisions become very clear, right? So you have your dominant horizontal right here. Okay. And I'll bring this back up and I'll get that into place. You have your dominant here, horizontal. You've got a dominant vertical here, because your vertical that runs here is the strongest between this area and that, but it also runs alongside this pot or this kettle, whatever you want to call it. Your dominant diagonal line is here. Even though it's not a line itself, it's implied due to the spacing of the objects. The spacing is creating a visual line here. They're connected at an angle. From there, you have subordinate lines, and I'll point those out as well. You have a horizontal line here. You have another vertical there. You have another vertical there, here, here, and here, and a few more horizontal lines there. You also have aerial perspective, and that creates the illusion of the third dimension on a 2-dimensional surface. If you notice the objects in the front, they have more contrast. They're more detailed. These shades are darker. They're very predominant. The further back you go, you get less contrast. You get less sharpness. That's what they call aerial perspective. You can find this on my website under techniques. I have a huge list of design techniques that in Myron's DVDs he talks about heavily, and I learned a lot from that. But Again, it's called aerial perspective, and it creates the illusion of the third dimension. A lot of times I'll see paintings where the artist doesn't understand this concept. For example, they might have the same figure in the background here, but the contrast is strong as it is in the front, and it destroys that third dimension. So it's just something to point out. All right, let me drop the armature down on this, and I'll point out a few things, especially where these lines are coming from. All right, so we have the armature drawn out. Let me lay down the most obvious lines and where Juliette's getting them from. So you have a horizontal line which is coming from here, okay? And this actually runs across the kettle right in this area here where the lid is. It's running right through it. So even though the kettle is curved, it's still creating a continuity across the plane. You have another vertical here. If I could draw that straight, it's intersecting with these two lines there. That's giving you that line in the background. You have that horizontal I talked about there. You have that vertical running along that path, and so on. And those are the most obvious. You have another division there. I'm going to bring this vertical down further because it does run through the pot. All right, what I want to show is where this line's coming from, because when you look at it, you go, okay, it's not fitting the rule of thirds, so they must be breaking the rules. I never liked that term because it implies, usually that term comes about by people that aren't trained in design. When they come across something they don't understand, they assume the artist is breaking the rules. Design is not a rule, in my opinion. It's not a rule. It's a system of design. It's an architecture. It's a mathematical architecture. Even though I don't show math, it's not necessary, right? It's a physical math, as Myron would say. But with that said, let me show where this dominant vertical is actually coming from. All right, let me see if I can get this. If I draw a horizontal through these diagonal intersecting lines and I bring it over, then from that point I can drop a vertical where that diagonal intersects that horizontal line, which is right there. It drops down, it intersects this diagonal line at this point right here, and that is right there, and then there is your dominant horizontal line. Again, it's falling within the armature, but the artist is using the armature to go outside of those obvious intersecting lines and dropping that horizontal line very low in the frame or on the canvas, so to speak. All right, so let me highlight a few of these. It's not everything in the composition, but it's a lot of the dominant lines. So you have your dominant horizontal there. As I mentioned, you have your dominant vertical there. You have your subordinate horizontal running there. And again, like I said, it cuts across this area in the pot. Then you have some horizontal lines framing in elements. Your pot there, you have some diagonal lines framing in these areas, right? And Connor Walton does this a lot in his. He draws the armature on the canvas, and I know Juliette does that as well. Some are more planned out than others. Some are more complex than others. Depends on what the artist wants to do. If it's a quick instructional and they're teaching somebody, they'll tend to draw the armature on the canvas and do it live. Whereas if you have the opportunity as an artist to plan out your design where you want to go, more complicated, you can do that, but there's many ways you can use this armature. Notice here too, and I'll just point this out, you can find verticals that come into play in the shadows as well. And also notice here, where the diagonal lines intersect, you have an eye. Notice how the eyes tend to fall on the objects themselves. So let me pull away some of these lines so it's a little bit more clear. Again, Charles Below talks about this in the Painter's Secret Geometry. Once you get your vertical and horizontals down, the armature becomes the scaffolding. You're just removing it at the end, right? I mean, that's the whole point of it. You're creating a structure that's visually pleasing. This is why design's not intuitive, by the way. You can't do this intuitively. I came across a video, somebody who painted something intuitively and they dropped the armature down and said, hey, yeah, certain things line up, so I must be really good at this. I do this intuitively. That's not a thing. It doesn't work. Occasionally you can get something that sort of falls in line, but design's more precise than that. These lines, these angles, these divisions, they're all precise. They're notes on a page, right? They're very specific spacing between the lines and the angles and all of it. It's a rhythm. It's a visual rhythm. And you can't do this intuitively. Like I said, you can kind of get sort of lucky once in a while. But when I'm looking at work, one way I can tell somebody's classically trained in design, if you look at their portfolio overall and it all looks good, all the designs look strong, you know they're trained. If you come across somebody where they might have one good one and then 5 bad ones, you know they're not. They just, like I said, they sort of got lucky a little bit. But again, even that lucky person, it's not precise where you would call it, a really solid design. It just doesn't fit all the elements of a good, thought out architectural design, which all artists should do in their work. Because one thing I don't mention often as well is that I came across a video. I actually own a video. Trying to remember the guy's name. I have it on my website. It's on my homepage. He has a DVD. He has a video on composition. He says it straight up. If you want work to sell, you need to understand design. You need to design using the armature. You can't do it intuitively because that type of work, generally speaking, does not fly off the wall, as he would say. He mentions that even if somebody who is not skilled in all the classically trained stuff, for example, like the drawing and the painting side of that, if their design is good, it'll still sell. But if you have somebody that's trained in all the atelier trained information, how to draw, how to paint, and so on, but they can't design, that stuff doesn't move. That's going to be it for today. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it, as always.